Our text for April 2nd, Maundy, Thursday, is from Mark 14, verses 12 to 26. This is the account of Jesus gathering his disciples together to celebrate the Passover, then instituting the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Note the immediate connections here, especially the connection to the first day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the sacrament of the Passover. For other connections, other side looking here, you should look at, read Exodus chapter 12 through chapter 13, verse 16. That'll help. The Passover itself is a result of the 10th plague preceding the Exodus journey. This plague was the death of the firstborn, and in order not to be stricken by this plague, the Hebrews were instructed to take a lamb or goat, one per family, kill it, and use a hyssop branch to place its blood on the doorposts and the lintel of their homes. This would cause the angel of death to pass over their homes because of the blood of the Lamb. Thus, the Passover was instituted by God as a memorial day, a feast to remember God's deliverance from death, and secured by the blood of a lamb. Passover is to be celebrated yearly, with the lamb being sacrificed on the first day of the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. The Passover lamb is to be eaten with unleavened bread, and for 7 days no leaven is to be consumed or even found in the house of the Israelites. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins with the Passover feast, and then it ends with another feast on the 7th day in remembrance of God bringing them out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Considering the Hebrew way of dividing days then, the Passover ushers in the 7-day feast of unleavened bread, which equates to 8 days of no leaven. The context then of Passover and of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is important in understanding our text for today for Maundy, Thursday. Passover, with all of its Christological and sacramental character, becomes the foundation for the Lord's institution of the Lord's Supper, or the Holy Supper, the Eucharist. It is important to note the common motifs and the connections as each one points to and helps us understand the other. Now certainly, John the Baptizer has at least this in mind as he declared, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So we note the sequence and the timing. That becomes important here. The sequence and the timing that Mark himself provides. We begin as we look at chapter 14, verse 1, earlier on, and it says, 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And now here we are in 14:12 at the beginning of our pericope, and it says, "On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb." The first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we want to take note here of the word here, Pascha, Ethuon, and once again Pascha here. This is the lamb, the Passover lamb. It's also where we get our language of Paschal lamb and the Pascha. We frequently hear about that. Now returning to the timing of events, the Passover is taking place on a Thursday evening with Friday beginning at 6 p.m. according to the Hebrew accounting. The Passover then officially begins on Friday, our Good Friday, when we're remembering the blood of the Lamb and the rescue from sin and death. Thus the blood of Christ, our Paschal Lamb, rescues us from death brought by sin as He is raised up on the cross. Frequently we get Thursday and Friday, we make our distinction at midnight, but for the Hebrews at 6 p.m. begins the next day. Now, as we look at verses 13 through 15 of our text, note the detailed instruction given to the two disciples. It's very similar to chapter 11, and those instructions also very detailed, given to the disciples as they prepare for the triumphal entry. The title here in verse 14, Ho Didaskalos, the teacher. Apparently this title is enough to clearly identify Jesus, who Jesus is to the master of the house, where they are called upon to celebrate the Passover feast, to prepare for the celebration of that. Now you could say that previous arrangements had been made, perhaps. The text really isn't that clear, one way or the other. But you have to ask the question, an empty room in Jerusalem during this week of all weeks of the year, well, it does beg the question as to why there would be any empty room at all unless something had been arranged ahead of time. But again, the text isn't clear on that point, so either way. We also note in verse 16, Luke 22, verse 8, the verse 16 where it talks about the two disciples. Now in Luke, the Luke account will tell us that those are Peter and John, but it's not necessarily stated here in John, or in Mark, but Peter and John are the disciples identified for us in Luke. In verse 17, we once again see this timing going on here. And it was evening, and when it was evening. The timing can't be exactly pinpointed. However, think of it this way. They gather together. It's Maundy, Thursday in our terminology. And the eating and the drinking begins. But it's not over. And it continues on into what the Hebrews would call Friday then for them. What we call Good Friday. Certainly the meal went past 6 p.m. I think we're pretty certain of that. Now in verse 18 we hear then Jesus making that shocking announcement. One of you will betray me. Let's see, verse 18. Truly I say to you, one of you betray me, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Are these synonymous, or are they something else going on here? I mean, obviously none of the disciples suspect Judas, because in verse 19 we note that they seem to be more concerned about if they're the one he's talking about. Is it I, Lord? Is it I? So Judas, nobody else really knows apart from Christ. Verse 20 then, one of the 12, going back here, one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl, here in verse 20, and here we go. One of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl. Again, the question is, are these, you see our do this real quick. The distinction here between the two, how they're separated, we saw that before. The same idea. So up here in verse 18 too, the question is, are those synonymous statements? Or are they an example of Hebrew step parallelism? For what those of you probably don't remember, but at this point, but step parallelism is like the second phrase is similar to the first, but you get more focus or a little more information in addition. Frequently, though, like in this case, it would narrow the focus. So, one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl, and maybe not all of the 12 are dipping in the same bowl, for instance. It's just, again, difficult to know whether synonymous or extra information is being provided. But it's a very common Hebrew structure to do something like that. Verse 21 then. I'm going to point out the word here. Gegrapai. Oops, that was a mistake. Let's try this again. Gegrapai. Written really indicates that this is recorded in the Old Testament scriptures at this point. Jesus makes it clear that what is about to happen is a fulfillment of scriptural prophecy and is not controlled, we're going to see this again for Good Friday, not controlled by anybody else, not controlled by the betrayer. However, his words to the betrayer, are extremely strong, might even have invoked some pity for the betrayer from the others. We also see this recorded in Psalm 41:9, these words. Where does the uaideh? Oh, it's on there somewhere. Here we go. Uaideh, the woe, but woe, woe being the opposite of blessed. And then we have the paradidotai, the being betrayed. The way this is put together gives us the idea that Judas has already begun the process. He's in the process of betraying. He's already, I think the accounts usually tell us, he's already met with the chief priests and the scribes. And Jesus is aware, not that what he's going to do, but what he is in the process of doing, even as he has been doing, is doing, will continue to do, the being betrayed here. Now when we get to verses 22 through 24, pretty familiar verses to us, the words of institution. I think most of us are familiar. These are also recorded in Matthew 26, Luke 22, and 1 Corinthians 11. It is interesting to note, none of the wording of any of these four accounts of the words institution, none of them are identical. However, they don't contradict each other either. So while they're not exactly the same, they're certainly not contradicting one another. Okay, so as we look at these, this institution takes place near the end of the feast or at the end of the Passover feast. It's some question if this is at the very end of the feast or after the feast is over. I would propose that it's probably near the end but not the end, because the tradition is that they sing a hymn at the very end, and we see that recorded then later on here toward, I think it's verse 26 or so. So I think we're actually in the Passover feast, the ritual or the performing of that, but I think we're at the very end. Now it would take us past 6 p.m., I think that we can safely say that. So here we are at the end, and Jesus then, he says, this is my body. He takes the bread, and the language here of my body. As you know, we have all sorts of excitement out there concerning the elements of Holy Communion and what's going on, and those who say they're symbolic, those who transubstantiation versus real presence, all these different things. But I think it's real easy to look at this and understand the idea of the my body, and the my blood. The pronoun here, it really doesn't allow the idea of symbol or representation. Jesus says this is my, meaning his actual body, his actual blood. Now here in verse 24, you'll see that some manuscripts will, right here, they will, right about this point, they will insert the word, I think it's kainos, meaning new, because diathekes here is the word for covenant. I think they're trying, these manuscripts are probably attempting to make this balance and agree with the 1 Corinthians and the Luke text, but it probably doesn't belong here. It's probably an addition that's been put in later manuscripts and the like. The Greek word for covenant, right here, diathekes, that's the equivalent then of the Old Testament, the Hebrew, the berith, meaning covenant. So that's make clear that that's the big word here in the Old Testament, and so this is going to conjure up all sorts of understanding and thoughts amongst the disciples, and this will help them understand what's really going on here. And then we have the words poured out for many here in the same verse. The idea for many, it's important to keep track of here that this isn't just for the disciples. It's for everybody. In other words, for the church for all time. It's not just a sacrament that's just for the apostles gathered there that day. It's for many. And a continuation here. Going on to verse 25 then, we see the fruit of the vine. Get back to here. Here we go. The fruit of the vine is in both the Old and the New Testament. This kind of language, fruit of the vine, is really talking about wine. They don't really use it in any other context that I've ever noted. It's always wine. And so, of course, that means it can't be grape juice, for example. It's actually wine, fermented grape juice. So, again, we've run into that. I'm not going to go into all those excitements there. And then finally here in verse 25, we also see the big phrase, the kingdom of God. Another pretty powerful phrase. I really think the way this is put together here, the way Jesus uses this, that he's actually making a reference or pointing to the eternal kingdom of heaven and the marriage feast of the Lamb. We see the connections between these feasts then, the feast of Holy Supper, the Eucharist, and the marriage feast of the Lamb and His kingdom in Revelation 19, verse 9. I think you see that pretty clearly connected here as you look at that. So here in this text for Maundy Thursday, Jesus shows His fulfillment not only of the Passover itself, but of the entire Exodus. The Exodus journey begins with the Passover feast and leaving the evil, sinful land of bondage, the land of Egypt, to journey through the wilderness. And the journey culminates then in the Promised Land. Jesus' journey then begins with the Passover feast, His journey to the cross, and a new feast as He journeys through that wilderness of sin, evil, even unto death, but culminates then in the resurrection and then His ascension to the promised land of everlasting life, where the marriage feast of the Paschal Lamb is celebrated forever. So I pray that God would bless the remainder of your Lenten journey.